It was a chilly January afternoon in Baltimore, 1999. Classes had just let out, and a bright, ambitious young woman got into her car, planning to pick up her cousin before heading to her job. But somewhere between school and work, she disappeared. That night, she never made it home. As the days passed with no sign of her, worry spread through the community and soon turned into fear. Rumors began to swirl, stories of love, jealousy, and hidden truths no one wanted to face. When answers finally came, they set off one of the most divisive and hotly debated cases in American true crime history. Hae Min Lee was born on October 15, 1980, in South Korea. She grew up with her mother and younger brother, raised with care and determination. In 1992, when Hae was 11, the family made a big move to the United States, settling in Maryland with her grandparents. From the start, Hae stood out. She was bright, ambitious, and talented in many areas. In school, she joined an advanced program for gifted students and excelled in both academics and sports. She played lacrosse and hockey with real passion and skill. By her teenage years, she was known as hardworking, independent, and mature beyond her age. At just 17, she managed school, sports, and a part-time job at an optician's office, impressing everyone with her discipline. In April 1998, Hae began dating a classmate, Adnan Syed. Adnan was born in the US to strict Pakistani Muslim parents. At home, traditions were clear: no dating, no alcohol, no drugs. But Adnan often lived differently outside the house. To his classmates, he seemed like the perfect American teenager: popular, athletic, charming, and even elected prom prince. He played football, ran track, trained as an EMT, and was known as friendly and easygoing. Like many high school romances, their relationship had sweet moments and rough patches. In her diary, Hae described Adnan as thoughtful and kind, remembering little gestures like him surprising her with a rose in class. But religion was always a challenge between them. Adnan admitted that being with her felt like a sin in his faith. That tension came to a head on Halloween night, when his parents discovered their relationship and reacted strongly. The next day, Hae ended things. Still, the two weren't finished. Within weeks, they got back together, and by November, Hae confessed in her diary that she still loved him. Adnan would sometimes stop by her work just to see her. But as the year came to a close, Hae's focus began to shift. She grew close to a new co-worker, Don Clendening, who was 22 and worked at the same optical shop where his mother was the manager. Don was supportive, kind, and more mature. He admired Hae's independence, and she found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't felt before. In her diary, Hae admitted she felt caught between two relationships. Adnan was aware of her doubts, and the cultural and religious differences between them only made things harder. What Hae longed for was a relationship without secrets, one where she could be open with her partner's family and not feel ashamed. She had never told her own relatives about Adnan, and over time, she felt like she was losing part of herself. By mid-December, she finally ended things with him. Not long after, she began seeing Don, who gave her the openness and stability she had been looking for. With her senior year ahead, a new romance, and strong academic achievements, Hae's future looked bright. But only weeks later, everything changed. On January 13, 1999, Hae was last seen leaving school around 2:15 in the afternoon. She got into her car, planning to pick up her younger cousin from daycare before heading to her job. It seemed like an ordinary day, but she never made it. For someone as responsible as Hae, disappearing like this didn't make sense. Her family immediately knew something was wrong and contacted the police. By that evening, investigators had reached out to Adnan, who told them he had last seen her earlier at school. They also questioned Don, who explained he had been at work all day, from morning until evening, and hadn't seen her. Police grew deeply concerned. Hae had no history of family conflict, no reason to run away, and no signs of trouble in her life. Her sudden disappearance was both alarming and heartbreaking. Days turned into weeks, and her absence weighed heavily on her loved ones, especially her mother, who endured the unbearable pain of waiting for answers. Then, nearly 4 weeks later, on February 9th, a call came in that changed everything. A man reported stumbling upon what looked like a human foot in a shallow grave while walking through a wooded area. Authorities rushed to the scene. In a quiet section of the forest park, they discovered a body. The location already had a grim history, as others had been buried there before. Soon, investigators confirmed what his family had feared most: it was her. She was just 18 years old. An autopsy revealed she had been killed by manual strangulation, a detail that made the crime feel even more brutal. News of her death spread quickly, shaking the community. Vigils were held, and friends and neighbors gathered to honor the young woman whose life had been cut short. At first, investigators looked closely at the man who had found the body. He explained he had pulled over to drink a beer and relieve himself when he came across the grave. His story checked out, and nothing suspicious tied him to the crime. Next, police turned their attention to Don, Hae's new boyfriend. His time card showed he had been at work the entire day she disappeared, and nothing pointed to his involvement either. Just as the investigation began to lose momentum, an anonymous phone call shifted everything. The caller gave police a name, Adnan. They claimed he was responsible and even suggested he had once threatened his life. Detectives began piecing together the couple's relationship, and what they heard from friends painted a far more complicated picture. Friends described Hae and Adnan's relationship in very different ways. Some said Adnan sometimes worried she didn't love him enough, while others recalled that Hae felt he could be controlling, which clashed with her independent nature. One of her close friends, Stephanie, shared that Adnan hadn't expected Hae to leave him for someone else. Hae's diary reflected the same tension. She wrote about how difficult the breakup had been for him to accept. She still cared for him, so she struggled to understand how her feelings had changed so quickly. It was the kind of confusion many teenagers face, but others noticed troubling signs. By early December, friends described Adnan as jealous, often asking if Hae was being unfaithful. Then came a discovery that unsettled investigators, a note among Hae's belongings where Adnan had written a threat to kill her. It echoed what the anonymous caller had already told police. Yet, their relationship hadn't been only dark. Around the holidays, the two had exchanged gifts and even helped each other when their cars broke down. To detectives, it seemed possible Adnan believed they might reconcile again, as they had before. But by New Year's, Hae was moving on. She had gone on her first date with Don, and detectives believed Adnan only became aware of this new relationship around January 5th. To follow that lead, they pulled his phone records to see who he had spoken with. One name stood out, Jennifer. At first, nothing seemed unusual in her account. But the very next day, she returned to the station with a lawyer, and her story changed. Jennifer claimed that Adnan had spent time with his friend Jay on the day of Hae's disappearance. She added something shocking. Jay had told her that Adnan confessed to killing Hae. This gave police a new direction. They brought Jay in for questioning. During interviews, he claimed Adnan had spoken about wanting to kill Hae, especially after learning about Don. He described Adnan as someone who wasn't used to losing. At first, Jay hadn't taken the talk seriously, but detectives saw it as evidence of a dangerous mindset. Adnan's situation became even more troubling when another detail surfaced. On January 9th, just days before her death, Hae updated her online profile, proudly declaring Don as the new love of her life. Then, on January 12th, the day before the crime, Adnan had signed up for a new cell phone. The account wasn't even in his own name, but under the name of a friend from his mosque. That night, he made several calls to friends, including multiple attempts to reach Hae. To investigators, this looked like one more piece of a puzzle pointing toward him. On February 28, 1999, 6 weeks after Hae's disappearance, police arrested Adnan. At a press conference, they explained his history with Hae and suggested the motive may have been rooted in obsession and heartbreak. The arrest sent shockwaves through Baltimore's Muslim community. Many who knew Adnan refused to believe he could be guilty. They describe him as respectful, kind, and devoted to his faith, someone with no history of violence. Some even believed police had rushed to judgment under pressure to solve the case. Hae's family, however, felt certain. Her mother, devastated by the loss, wanted justice. To her, only a severe punishment for Adnan could bring that. Adnan himself insisted he was innocent. He said that on the afternoon Hae disappeared, he had been at the library with a classmate named Aisha McLean. He claimed he still loved and respected Hae and would never have harmed her. When detectives pressed him about the phone calls the night before, Adnan explained that it had been Hae who called him, asking to reconcile. Investigators doubted that story. After all, she couldn't have known his new number so quickly. After the call Adnan claimed came from Hae, she wrote in her diary one last time. That entry, written after spending a day with Don, was clear. She was deeply in love with her new boyfriend. For detectives, the possibility of her reconciling with Adnan seemed unlikely. Eventually, Adnan was officially charged with first-degree murder. Things grew more complicated when Jay was brought back in for further questioning in March. This time, his testimony went further. He claimed Adnan had confessed to the killing and that he himself had helped bury his body. According to Jay, Adnan called him after the crime, picked him up, and showed him his body in the trunk of his car. In a dramatic twist, Jay then led police to a crucial piece of evidence, the location of Hae's car, which until that point had been missing. To prosecutors, this made their case significantly stronger. When the trial began in early 2000, the prosecution leaned heavily on two things: cell phone records, which placed Adnan's phone near the forest park that night, and Jay's testimony. But Jay's story was not perfectly consistent. While the overall details stayed the same, he shifted timelines, changing when Adnan supposedly called him and the moment he saw his body. The defense seized on these contradictions, arguing Jay was unreliable. And beyond his words, there was no physical evidence linking Adnan to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA in Hae's car. Adnan also had a potential alibi. Aisha McLean, a classmate, was willing to testify that she saw him in the library at the time the crime was believed to have happened. But for reasons never fully explained, the defense chose not to call her as a witness. After 6 weeks of testimony, on February 26, 2000, the verdict came down. Adnan was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, plus more than 30 additional years. Just a month later, Jay pleaded guilty to being an accessory and was given only 2 years of probation. The following year, Adnan's lawyers filed an appeal, arguing in part that not calling Aisha as a witness had seriously weakened his defense. But the appeal was denied, and his conviction stood. As time passed, the case refused to fade away. It began attracting national and even international attention. Journalists, podcasters, and private investigators dug back into the evidence, raising new questions about whether Adnan had really been the killer. Some theories pointed directly at Jay. Supporters of this view believed he may have committed the crime himself and framed Adnan to avoid suspicion. One idea suggested Hae had threatened to expose his drug dealing. Another claimed she had discovered him cheating on his girlfriend, Stephanie. Either motive, they argued, could have pushed him to act. But there were major flaws. There was no real evidence against Jay, and Hae had never written anything in her diary that hinted at such a discovery. In truth, she wasn't even close to him, making it unlikely she would have been alone with him in a way that allowed for the crime. A variation of the theory suggested that Jay and Jennifer had worked together to frame Adnan, possibly because they were secretly involved and had found out. But again, the same issues appeared. Hae wasn't close to either of them, and there was no evidence tying them to the murder. Attention eventually shifted to Don, Hae's boyfriend at the time. His alibi, which initially seemed solid, began raising questions. The confirmation of his work schedule had come from his own mother, who managed the optical shop. Later, some noticed that the employee number on his log sheet didn't match his. Adding to the suspicion, police weren't able to reach Don until 1 in the morning after Hae disappeared. He told them he had returned home around 7 that evening, but he never followed up with investigators as he had promised. Another name also drew attention: the man who had discovered his body. His story was that he had pulled off the road to drink a beer and relieve himself when he stumbled upon the shallow grave. Later reports revealed he did have a criminal record, but it was connected to indecent exposure, not violence. He was given 2 polygraph tests, failing the first and passing the second. Experts noted that nerves alone could explain those results. More importantly, there was no logical reason for the killer to personally alert authorities by leading them directly to the body. Without a motive, suspicion toward him faded quickly. Meanwhile, speculation continued online. True crime forums suggested links to other unsolved murders from the same time period, even raising the idea of a serial killer. But investigators dismissed these theories after finding no evidence tying those cases to his death. In the end, detectives and prosecutors circled back to the same conclusion: Adnan. To them, he was the one with motive, means, and opportunity. Years later, the legal battle resurfaced. In 2012, Adnan again tried to overturn his conviction, but his appeal was denied the following year. Then, in 2015, Maryland's Court of Special Appeals paused proceedings and sent the case back for review. This time, the question was whether Aisha McLean's testimony should finally be heard. By November of that year, the higher court agreed to reopen the case. Independent journalists and private investigators had played a huge role in this shift. Their work exposed inconsistencies, raised questions about the reliability of the evidence, and pushed Aisha's account back into the spotlight. They also challenged the prosecution's use of cell phone tower data, pointing out that the records, especially for incoming calls, were not reliable and should never have been used to persuade a jury. In November 2015, a judge reopened the case. The following February, a new hearing drew national attention. Aisha testified under oath, confirming she had seen Adnan in the library on January 13, 1999. The day had disappeared. On June 13, 2016, the judge granted Adnan a new trial, ruling that his defense team had failed to properly challenge the cell phone evidence. Later that year, his lawyers requested bail while awaiting retrial, but the court denied it. 2 years later, Maryland's Court of Special Appeals sided with Adnan. But in 2019, the state's highest court reversed that decision, blocking the retrial. For Hae's family, it was a relief, a confirmation that justice had been served, and a chance, at last, to try to move forward. Then, in 2021, a new state law shifted the legal landscape. It allowed people convicted as minors who had already served more than 20 years in prison to petition for relief. In 2022, a Baltimore court reopened Adnan's case once again, this time citing major concerns about the effectiveness of his original defense. He was released from custody while the process continued. By September 2023, Adnan stood before reporters at a press conference. He once again declared his innocence, but this time he went further. Using a detailed presentation, he accused the prosecution of misconduct, arguing they had withheld information about alternative suspects. He also spoke about the heavy toll the case had taken on his family after more than 2 decades of fighting. Finally, in March 2025, the case reached another turning point. A Baltimore judge upheld Adnan's conviction but reduced his sentence, recognizing that he had already spent more than 2 decades behind bars. Adnan was granted 5 years of parole. Although the law still considered him guilty, he would not return to prison. Both prosecutors and the defense agreed he no longer posed any threat to society. More than 20 years after Hae Min Lee's death, her case, and Adnan Syed's conviction, remains one of the most fiercely debated stories in true crime. Was justice truly served, or did mistakes and overlooked evidence shape the outcome of the trial? Was Adnan guilty, or was he the casualty of a flawed system? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps the final word will never come.